Book 1, Part 2, Expulsion of Ariovistus from Gaul, 58 BC. 30. On the conclusion of the Helvetian campaign, the leading men of tribes in almost every part of Gaul came to offer Caesar congratulations. They realized, they said, that although his motive in fighting the Helvetii was to punish them for their past injuries to Rome, what had happened was just as much to the advantage of Gaul as of the Romans. For the intention of the Helvetii, in abandoning their home at a time when they enjoyed great prosperity, was to make war on all Gaul and become masters of it, and so to have the whole country from which to select the district they thought most fertile and convenient for settlement, and to compel the other tribes to pay tribute. The deputies asked Caesar to let them fix a day for convening a pan-Gallic assembly, saying that there were certain requests they would like to submit to him when they were all agreed about them. With Caesar's consent, they appointed a date for this assembly, and swore to one another not to disclose its proceedings without its express authority. 31. When the assembly had met and concluded its business, the same chieftains who had been with Caesar before returned and asked leave to interview him privately in a place secluded from observation, in order to discuss a matter that concerned not only their own interest, but that of the whole country. When the interview was granted, they all prostrated themselves before him with tears in their eyes. They explained that they were very anxious to prevent what they said from being disclosed. This was just as important to them as obtaining the request they had come to make, because its disclosure would bring the most cruel punishment upon them. Their spokesman was the Aeduan Diviciacus. The Gauls, he said, were divided into two parties, one dominated by the Aedui, the other by the Arverni. After a fierce struggle for supremacy lasting many years, the Arverni and Sequani hired some German mercenaries to help them. 70 to 65 BC. A first contingent of about 15,000 had crossed the Rhine. But when the uncivilized barbarians had acquired a taste for residence in Gaul, with its good land and high standard of life, more were brought over, and there were at present about 120,000 of them in the country. The Aedui and their satellite tribes had fought the Germans more than once, and had suffered disastrous defeats, by which they lost all their noblest citizens, councillors, and knighthood. These calamities had broken the supremacy which they formerly maintained in Gaul by their own prowess, and by the ties of hospitality and friendship that united them with the Romans. And they had been forced to surrender their most distinguished citizens as hostages to the Sequani, and to bind themselves by oath not to attempt to recover them, and not to solicit the aid of Rome, but to submit forever without demur to the sovereign power of their conquerors. I myself, he said, am the only man of the whole Aeduan nation who could not be prevailed upon to swear this oath, or to give my children as hostages. That was why I fled my country and went to Rome to claim assistance from the Senate, because I alone was not restrained either by an oath or by the surrender of hostages. But a worse fate, he went on to say, had befallen the victorious Sequani than the conquered Aedui. For the German king Ariovistus had settled in their territory and seized a third of their land, the best in all Gaul. And now he was bidding them evacuate another third, because a few months previously he had been joined by 24,000 men of the Harudes, and must find them a home to settle in. In a few years' time, the whole population of Gaul would be expatriated, and all the Germans would migrate across the Rhine, for there was no comparison between the soil of Germany and that of Gaul, or between their respective standards of living. After a single victory over the united Gallic forces at Admagetobriga, 61 BC, Ariovistus had shown himself an arrogant and cruel tyrant, demanding the children of every man of rank as hostages, and making an example of them by the infliction of all manner of torture if the least indication of his will and pleasure was not instantly complied with. The man was an ill-tempered, headstrong savage, and it was impossible to endure his tyranny any longer. Unless Caesar and the Romans would help them, the Gauls must all do as the Helvetii had done: leave their homes, seek other dwelling places out of reach of the Germans, and take their chance of whatever fortune might befall them. If my words come to the ears of Ariovistus, he concluded, I do not doubt that he will inflict the most inhuman punishment on all the hostages he has in his power. But your great prestige, the recent victory of your army, and the terror of the Roman name could deter him from bringing fresh German hordes across and protect all Gaul from his depredations. 32. When Diviciacus had finished his speech, the whole deputation began with many tears to implore Caesar's aid. He noticed, however, that the Sequanian representatives did not follow the example of all the others, but hung their heads in dejection with their eyes fixed on the ground. In astonishment he asked them the reason for this behavior, but without making any reply, they maintained their attitude of silent dejection. After he had questioned them repeatedly without being able to get a word out of them, Diviciacus spoke again. The lot of the Sequani, he explained, was even more grievous and miserable than that of the rest, because they alone dared not, even in secret, complain or beg for relief. They stood in terror of Ariovistus's cruelty, even when he was far away, just as much as if they were in his presence. For while the others could at any rate flee away out of his reach, the Sequani, having admitted him into their midst, and allowed all their towns to fall into his power, must submit to any atrocities he chose to commit against them. 33. On receiving this information, Caesar reassured the Gauls and promised to attend to the matter, adding that he had great hopes that the privilege he had secured for Ariovistus, as well as the weight of his authority, would induce him to cease his oppression. He then dismissed the meeting. In addition to what he had been told, many other considerations convinced him that this problem must be faced and some action taken. The most important was the fact that the Aedui, who had frequently been styled by the Senate brothers and kinsmen of the Roman people, were enslaved and held subject by the Romans, and that Aeduan hostages were in the hands of Ariovistus and the Sequani, which, considering the mighty power of Rome, Caesar regarded as a disgrace to himself and his country. Furthermore, if the Germans gradually formed a habit of crossing the Rhine and entering Gaul in large numbers, he saw how dangerous it would be for the Romans. If these fierce barbarians occupied the whole of Gaul, the temptation would be too strong for them. They would cross the frontier into the province as the Cimbri and Teutoni had done before them, 109 to 101 BC, and march on Italy, for the Roman province lay just across the Rhone from the territory of the Sequani. This danger, he considered, must be provided against immediately. Moreover, Ariovistus personally had behaved with quite intolerable arrogance and pride. 34. Accordingly, Caesar decided to send envoys requiring him to select for a conference some place lying between their present positions, as he wished to discuss business of state of the highest importance to them both. To this delegation Ariovistus replied, "If I wanted anything from Caesar, I should go to him. So if he wants anything of me, he must come to me." He added that he dared not come without the protection of his army into the part of Gaul occupied by Caesar, and that to concentrate his forces would mean making elaborate and troublesome arrangements for provisioning them. He could not imagine what business Caesar, or the Romans at all for that matter, had in the part of Gaul which was his by right of conquest. 35. At this, Caesar sent a second embassy to remind Ariovistus of the important privilege conferred upon him by himself and the Roman government when, during Caesar's consulship, 59 BC, he received from the Senate the titles of king and friend. Since his way of showing his gratitude was to refuse an invitation to a conference for the discussion of matters affecting their common interest, the envoys were instructed to deliver him an ultimatum. First, he was not to bring any more large bodies of men across the Rhine into Gaul. Secondly, he was to restore the Aeduan hostages he held, and to authorize the Sequani to restore those whom they held. Finally, he was not to oppress the Aedui or to make war on them or their allies. On these conditions, Caesar and the Roman government would maintain cordial and friendly relations with him. If these demands were refused, then, in accordance with a decree of the Senate passed in the consulship of Marcus Messala and Marcus Piso, 61 BC, directing all governors of the province of Gaul to do everything consistent with the public interest to protect the Aedui and other Roman allies, Caesar would not fail to punish his ill treatment of them. 36. In reply, Ariovistus said that it was the recognized custom of war for victors to rule the vanquished in any way they pleased, and that the Romans acted on this principle by governing their conquered subjects not according to the dictates of any third party, but at their own discretion. Since he did not dictate to them how they were to exercise their rights, he ought not to be interfered with in the exercise of his. It was because the Aedui had tried the fortune of war and were the losers in the fight that they had to pay him tribute, and Caesar was doing him a serious wrong in coming to Gaul and causing him a loss of revenue. He would not return the hostages to the Aedui, but would refrain from making any wanton attack upon them or their allies if they kept their agreement and paid the tributes regularly each year. If they did not, the title of brothers of the Roman people would not save them from the consequences. I am not impressed, he concluded, by Caesar's threat to punish my oppression of these people. No one has ever fought me without bringing destruction upon himself. Let him attack whenever he pleases. He will discover what German valor is capable of. We have never known defeat. We have had superb training in arms, and for 14 years have never sheltered beneath a roof. 37. At the very moment when this message was being reported to Caesar, delegations arrived from the Aedui and the Treveri. The Aedui came to complain that the Harudes, who had lately crossed into Gaul, were ravaging their territory, and that even the surrender of hostages had failed to induce Ariovistus to leave them in peace. The Treveri stated that 100 clans of the Suebi had encamped on the bank of the Rhine and were trying to cross under the command of Nasua and his brother Symberius. Caesar was much perturbed by this news and decided that he must act immediately, lest, if this fresh horde of Suebi joined forces with Ariovistus's veteran troops, it might become more difficult to resist them. Accordingly, he arranged for a supply of grain as quickly as he could, and advanced at top speed towards Ariovistus. 38. After 3 days' march, it was reported that the German was hastening with all his forces to occupy Besançon, the largest town of the Sequani, and had already advanced 3 days' journey beyond his own frontier. Caesar felt that he must take energetic measures to prevent the fall of this town, for it contained an abundance of military stores of every kind, and its natural defences were so strong that it offered every facility for protracting hostilities. The river Doubs forms an almost complete and perfect circle round it. The gap left unprotected is little more than 500 yards wide, and is blocked by a high hill so completely that the spurs at its base run right down to the river bank on either side. This hill was girt by a wall which gave it the strength of a citadel and joined it with the town. Caesar hastened there by forced marches, continued day and night, occupied the town, and placed a garrison in it. 39. During the few days that they had spent near Besançon to lay in a stock of corn and other provisions, the soldiers began to question the Gauls and merchants there, who talked about the enormous stature, incredible courage, and splendid military training of the Germans. Some affirmed that on many occasions when they had met them in battle, the very expression on their faces and the fierce glance of their eyes were more than they could endure. This gossip threw all ranks into a sudden panic that completely unnerved them. It began with the military tribunes, the prefects of the auxiliary troops, and the men with little experience of war who had followed Caesar from Rome in order to cultivate his friendship. Most of these alleged some urgent reason or other for leaving camp and asked Caesar's permission to go. Some stayed out of shame and a desire to avoid the suspicion of cowardice. But they were unable to hide their feelings, and at times could not help shedding tears. Skulking in their tents, they bemoaned their fate or joined their friends in lamenting the peril that threatened them all alike. All over the camp men were signing and sealing their wills. The talk of these frightened people gradually affected even seasoned campaigners, including some centurions and cavalry officers. Those who wished to be thought less timid than the rest said that it was not the enemy they feared, but the narrow defiles through which they had to pass and the great forests that lay between them and Ariovistus, or pretended to be afraid that it would prove impossible to maintain an adequate supply of corn. Some even went so far as to tell Caesar that when he gave the command to strike camp and advance, the soldiers would be too panic-stricken to obey. 40. Observing this state of affairs, Caesar summoned the centurions of every grade to a council and began by severely reprimanding them for presuming to inquire or conjecture where he was leading them or with what object. At the time of his consulship, he said, Ariovistus had sought the friendship of Rome with great eagerness. And what reason was there for thinking that he would so light-heartedly refuse to carry out his obligations? For his own part, he was convinced that when the king was acquainted with his demands and saw the fairness of the terms proposed, he would not reject the friendship offered by the Roman government and by himself. If, however, a mad impulse should lead him to make war, what reason had they after all for being afraid? Both their own courage and his careful attention to his duties gave good grounds for confidence. Our countrymen faced this enemy, he continued, in our father's time, when Gaius Marius won a victory over the Cimbri and Teutoni, by which, as all agreed, the whole army earned as much glory as its commander. They faced them again more recently in Italy when they defeated the rebellious slaves, aided though these were to some extent by the military training and discipline that they had acquired from their Roman masters. This shows what a great advantage resolute courage is. For a long time the Romans had an unreasoning fear of the slaves while they were still unarmed, yet afterwards defeated them when they were not only armed but flushed with victory. Moreover, these Germans are the same men whom the Helvetii have often met in battle, not only in Switzerland but also in Germany, and have generally defeated. Yet the Helvetii were not a match for our army. If anyone is alarmed by the fact that the Germans have defeated the Gauls and put them to flight, he should inquire into the circumstances of that defeat. He will find that it happened at a time when the Gauls were exhausted by a long war. Ariovistus had remained for many months on the cover of his camp and the surrounding marshes, so that they had no chance of fighting him, and then he attacked suddenly, when in despair of bringing him to battle they had broken up into scattered groups. Thus his victory resulted from his cunning strategy rather than the bravery of his troops. The employment of such strategy was possible against inexperienced natives, but even Ariovistus can have no hope of being able to trick our armies by such means. He went on to say that those who try to disguise their cowardice by pretending to be anxious about the corn supply or the difficulties of the route were acting presumptuously. It was plain that they either lacked confidence in their general's sense of duty or else meant to dictate to him. It was attending to these matters. Corn was being supplied by the Sequani, Luci, and Lingones, and the harvest was already ripe in the fields. And as to the route, they would soon be in a position to judge for themselves. The suggestion that the men would not obey orders to advance did not trouble him at all, for he knew that in all cases in which an army had refused obedience, it was either because their generals had been unsuccessful and were regarded as unlucky, or because they were proved dishonest by the discovery of some misconduct. His own integrity was attested by his whole life, his power of commanding success by the campaign against the Helvetii. Therefore he was going to do that very night what he had at first intended to defer till later. He would move camp in the early hours of the morning, so as to find out with the least possible delay whether their sense of honor and duty or their fear was the stronger. If no one else would follow him, he would go all the same, accompanied only by the 10th Legion. Of its loyalty he had no doubt, and it should serve as his bodyguard. Caesar placed the highest confidence in this legion for its bravery, and had shown it particular favor.